I would like to thank the organizers of the webinar for inviting me to make the first contribution. I must make 2 points. One, I have supplied the written text of this talk to the translator, so the translation will probably diverge somewhat from what I'm saying live, as it were, because I'm not reading it out. Secondly, as has been made clear, I'm not an expert on Iran, but I am regarded as an expert on fascism and the history of fascism, and that provides some examples of the transition from democracy to authoritarianism, and of course examples of the transition back to democracy. So the talk I'm going to give is slightly different from the thing I have written for the book later in the year, and I've called it Grounding Utopianism, and this will be the reason for the title will become clear. I'd like to make 4 basic points. One is the point about what we mean by democracy. As is well known, every authoritarian and totalitarian regime in the world invokes the principle of democracy. Democracy legitimizes the most terrible regimes. So it is important that we keep in mind the fact that when we say democracy, we mean a particular type of democracy, which we call liberal democracy. Now, I want to make it clear that liberal for me and for many other experts does not mean American, Western, secular, anti-religion, or anything of that nature. It means upholding the principle of universal human rights, the fundamental equality of human beings in rights, which was set forth in the document of the United Nations in its Declaration of Human Rights in 1948 and in many other similar statements. In other words, a liberal democracy is not anti-religious. On the contrary, it is transculturally humanistic. It appeals to the humanistic element in all types of society, culture, and creed. So the basic premise that I want to stress is that a democratic transition to a new Iran means that the principles of universal humanism must be built into the constitution, the basic laws, and the policies of the new state, and that also in the transition to it, the coalition of forces involved and required to make the transition must all be committed to universal human rights. Otherwise, factions will emerge which are anti-humanistic in their direction. The second point I want to make is that historically transitions to democracy have been very problematic. There are many unanticipated obstacles on the way towards a democratic society. And there are counter-humanistic and counter-progressive forces which can emerge suddenly following a thing called the law of unintended consequences. And I'm going to just point out very briefly 4 different ways a transition can go wrong. For a start, in the early stages, the attempt to liberalize a regime can actually produce a very radical backlash by the existing regime, which can get more repressive and can invoke militaristic control on the grounds of an emergency of state, and that can actually block the transition in an early stage. Syria and Myanmar and even Egypt to a degree represent that sort of problem. Then the foreign forces, international forces, foreign countries can get involved in the transition to block it because they have an interest in maintaining the status quo in the country. So that's another big problem. And then when the democracy is established, even on liberal principles, historically, democracy hosts a number of forces which are inimical, are hostile to genuine liberal democracy. And I'm going to just read out a few of them, if you'll excuse me looking down. Oligarchy, plutocracy, nepotism, corruption, extreme class divides, misogyny, ethnocentrism, racism, expansionist foreign policy, colonialism, ultranationalism, male chauvinism, militarism, personal dictatorship. If you look at the history of America, you will see from the 18th century revolution in America, many of those forces corrupting what should have been a liberal democracy from the start, in fact. And finally, there are cases where once you have established your liberal democracy, the presidency or the leadership is taken over by an individual with no commitment to democracy, who can turn the democracy into what is technically known as an illiberal democracy. And I would quote Turkey and Hungary and Russia as examples of that. The third point I'd like to make is that there is a problem with the actual enthusiasm for a transition. It can produce what I call, I've sort of introduced this word, a palingenetic community. Now, what on earth is that? Well, palingenesis means rebirth or a renewal or a new order. And in the early stage of a revolution, there can be such enthusiasm, popular fervor for the revolution, that a coalition of forces that can be formed, which actually contain anti-humanistic, anti-liberal forces, which actually then means that when the democracy is installed, extremist elements can rise to the top and actually start repressing the moderate elements, the liberal elements, the humanistic elements. If you look at the French Revolution and the rise of Jacobinism and Napoleonism and the etc., and then of the bourgeoisie, you can see how a liberal revolution can be undone from inside. So it's very important that moderates are radical in the sense that they are determined not to be marginalized by extremist forces, that they use Machiavellian cleverness in making sure that they stand by their principles, and that they do not allow moderate to mean weak, easy to push over, easy to suppress. And my fourth point is the need history shows for a broad coalition of progressive forces whenever a revolution takes place. In other words, in the case of Iran now, enlightened, I would put humanistic forces within the Iranian diaspora, within Iran itself, in the cultural and political elites, but also in the people. There are millions of Iranian people who long for the freedoms guaranteed by humanism, but also the international community, which has a vested interest in stable democracies, and of course the wonderful NGOs, all of whom are committed to universal principles of humanism. So in a nutshell, what I'm trying to get across is the idea that there are a lot of dangers involved in making a transition to a liberal democracy. And it's not enough for it to be a democracy. I am calling for what I am calling in this talk grounded utopianism. And I'd like to illustrate this principle in a speech made by Theodore Roosevelt. Now, Theodore Roosevelt is of the same dynastic family in the United States that produced Franklin D. Roosevelt, who eventually brought America into the war against Nazism. In 1900, he made a comment which I think is relevant to this webinar. He said, "The head in the air theorists will not succeed in politics any more than in law or physics or commerce. We've got to face facts. An uncomfortable truth is a safer companion than the most attractive falsehood. Strive mightily for high ideals. Keep your eyes on the stars, but don't forget that your feet must be grounded on the earth." So I wish all those working for a peaceful, humanistic, liberal transition to a new Iran the very best of fortune. And I hope in my minute way I have contributed to spelling out some of the pitfalls, some of the dangers which idealists must keep in mind to keep their feet grounded on the earth. Thank you very much.